this video about section 2 of Kant's Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals is really going to focus on the imperative. So we're going to talk about what an imperative is and the different kinds of imperatives that Kant thinks we encounter in our activities. So in the end of section 1, starting around page 14 or so, Kant introduces the idea of universality, and we'll see that this really is the first formulation of the categorical moral imperative, right? So he continues to develop the universality of the moral law in section 2. So the first section moved us from what he thought was sort of an average or what he thought was like a common way of understanding it, right? The title of the first section is From Ordinary Knowledge of Morality to the Philosophical. So he shifted us from our ordinary way of thinking about morality and the particulars of our daily lives into what he thinks is the properly philosophical mode of talking about the form, like the formal elements. So at the end of the first section, when he introduces the principle of universality, he's doing so as part of his move to escape consideration for all the particulars, right? Because if the goodwill is good without qualification, that means it can't be qualified by, it can't be inflected through, modified by, motivated by the particular push and pull of our everyday desires and inclinations and tendencies and so on. To do this or that particular thing, that's not good in itself. So what happens is we need the universal form that is capable of generating all rules in particular, right? That's why he's looking at reason, because if reason produces rules, it produces rules for every conceivable thing that we do. Rules for cognition, rules for acting, that's what we're concerned with here, practical philosophy. So because reason produces all the particular rules, it must have like the form of rule-making itself, or the form of the rule itself in it. And if what morality demands is a universal formal rule that can be applied to all particulars, then reason is where you should find it. Because reason provides the form of rules as such. This is what Kant says. So when we've moved to the philosophical, we know that we need a universal rule that can't be contradicted, right? It can't be like an exception. It can't be something where you're like, oh, well, normally I would do this, but right now. Or it can't depend upon only you doing that. We'll see how, for Kant, a lie depends upon me assuming that everyone else will be honest. Like, my lie will only work if other people are being basically honest. So honesty for them, but not for me. I get to lie and be dishonest. So that's a contradiction, right? Or it's creating an exception to the rule. The universal rule has no exceptions. It applies to everything. So when we look then to where the idea of these imperatives begins to be developed in section 2, we see that an imperative basically is a rule. It's something that you have to do sort of by necessity. And that means that we're starting now to get an idea of what kind of necessity Kant is talking about. Remember, he says that duty is the necessity of an act, the necessity of an action, and it's necessitated out of respect for the moral law. So I cautioned that we don't want to think of this in the way that we think about like causal necessity. It's more of a logical or formal necessity. So think about it kind of like a conditional. If I want to do something, then I necessarily have to take this step. Like if I want to make hot tea, it's necessary to heat some water somehow. There are many ways I can go about heating the water. in an electric kettle on the stove top. The stove could be gas or whatever, over a campfire or somewhere in the backyard over a barrel or something. It doesn't really matter how, but to make the hot drink, the water needs to be heated. So that's the sense of necessity that we're talking about. And if we want to accomplish some necessary step, has to intervene. So an imperative, Kant will use the language of ought. An imperative is something that we should do. We don't, we're not made to do it. It's not like there's a force that comes and moves our hand and makes us do it. But it's something that we should do, and that is the kind of necessity. So if one of the things we should be doing or ought to be doing is trying to cultivate or produce a good will, there's where we're starting to see the force of necessity. If that's something we ought to do, then it's necessary that we follow these certain rules, and necessary to follow the categorical moral imperative. So that is where the idea of the imperative really starts to gain its philosophical sort of importance. Remember, anytime I act, I generate these rules in order to achieve my goal. I will some end, right? And reason provides me with the rules that I'll need to attain that end, and they're necessary for attaining that end. So those are imperatives. They're things I should or need to do if I want to achieve this goal. Now, the ultimate goal, of course, is the goodwill, right? So there are different kinds of imperatives. Not all imperatives are conducive to or necessary for the goodwill. The kind of example I gave about heating the teapot, for instance, that is really a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative is one that is geared toward the achievement of particular goals, right? So it involves some technical skill. It is, he calls them imperatives of skill or of art or something to that effect, that if I want to achieve this particular goal, then I'm going to need to follow these rules, like the tea kettle or whatever example you want to come up with. If you need to start your car, you have to have the key, right? So the hypothetical imperatives are very common, but there's no moral content to them. It's just getting stuff done, basically. Anything that requires some amount of skill. So certainly like playing an instrument, and if you're performing some sort of a dance, or if you're painting, also any kind of like carpentry or that kind of handiwork, welding, those are all things that are governed by hypothetical imperatives. Technical rules that govern the accomplishment of these specific tasks. The next thing Kant talks about is a sort of special case of these hypothetical imperatives that concern human happiness. So he said earlier in section 1 that to be happy is a duty. And here he mentions that happiness is necessary for rational beings. He says, there is one end that can be presupposed as actual for all rational beings, so far as they are dependent beings to whom imperatives apply. And thus there is one purpose which they not merely can have, but which can certainly be assumed to be such that they all do have by a natural necessity, and this is happiness. So, because all rational beings have by necessity the end of becoming happy, it's a duty to attempt to be happy. Practical rules that guide us toward this are of a special quality because they're guiding us toward a necessity, toward happiness. A hypothetical imperative which represents the practical necessity of an action as means for the promotion of happiness is assertoric, so it asserts itself, right? It is something that is asserted as grounded in the essence of a rational being, as something whose end is the pursuit of happiness. skill in the choice of means to one's own greatest well-being can be called prudence in the narrowest sense, and thus the imperative that refers to the choice of means to one's own happiness, the precept of prudence, remains hypothetical. The action is commanded not absolutely, but only as a means for a further purpose. So we have these hypothetical imperatives that are specifically geared toward the achievement of our happiness. Those are a little bit different because happiness is a necessity for rational beings. It's an end that we will universally. Every rational being wills as an end its own happiness. So you can see that Kant doesn't totally discredit happiness. It's just not the ultimate purpose of morality. Sometimes we don't achieve our happiness. We sometimes fail to do so. Sometimes doing the right thing is not actually sort of conducive so much to our immediate happiness, so we have a disinclination to do it, though of course it will be conducive to our happiness in the long run. We can see a little bit of that same line from Socrates, right? That to do one's duty for Kant is good for the soul. I mean, at the end of the day, Kant is a Christian, right? So you have that ultimate happiness waiting for you out there. And these are some things that are commanded by practical reason, Kant will say, in other places. So he doesn't get into that here in this. What I'm attempting to get at here is that ultimately there's not a conflict between doing your duty and your happiness, because your ultimately happiness depends upon you doing your duty and conforming yourself to the moral law. So there isn't really a contradiction between duties, for Kant anyway, because ultimately, in the grand sort of metaphysical picture, to do your duty is to seek your happiness. So these are special hypotheticals. Again, they're hypothetical because we each have to pick our specific means to achieve our happiness. Not everybody can do the exact same thing to be happy, and so because the means by which we attain happiness are so varied, and will apply such a wide variety of rules to achieving these different things that might lead to our happiness, they're still hypothetical, but they're sort of a special case. That leads us then finally to the categorical imperative. So this categorical imperative is, we'll see, as moral, and it governs our free action. So notice that when freedom enters in, when autonomy enters in, that's when the moral dimension arises, because he's going to say that autonomy is the supreme principle of morality. So what governs autonomy, the rules we should follow when we utilize our autonomy, that is the moral issue. So the categorical moral imperative is going to govern free actions. Now, when Kant is just going to drop the moral part from that title, for the rest of the book he's going to go on, he's going to talk about the categorical imperative. Now, the rule, of course, the form of the rule that governs free action is universality. And Kant makes the argument that any rational creature, this is the very beginning part of section 2, so just a slight review, any rational being will be bound by it. So it extends to all rationality, not just humans or not just man in Kant's language. So again, that emphasis on rationality and our capacity for it. I think there's a very worthwhile criticism of this element of Kant that comes from disability studies, where your moral worth seems tied to your capacity for reason. And so if your capacity for reason is sufficiently compromised, such as from some cognitive disability or something like that, the moral worth of your actions becomes sort of problematic, right? I don't know how. So one way that people will try to sort of salvage Kant is to say things like, well, if we just he's talking about universality, the system is built in terms of universality, so we can sort of extract that and expand the meaning of it to everybody. We don't do the racist stuff that Kant does, where we say that different races have different capacities for reason. Everybody has access to the same sort of capacity for reason. But so we can excise the good stuff out of Kant and leave behind the specific things, right? Oh, look, Kant's already set this up for us. We're looking at the form. We're not looking at the specificity, and the form can be universalized, right? I don't know if that actually works whenever you come at it from the disability angle, because there's no way to get around people's certain kinds of cognitive disability. That's something that some people, not everybody, is stuck with. And so you can't kind of just theoretically hand wave away that problem. I mean, I guess you could bite the bullet. I don't know why we would want to do such a thing and just say, well, yes, the moral worth of that is questionable. That doesn't seem particularly ethical on a whole host of reasons, for a whole host of reasons, but that's a discussion for another video. So that's something to keep in mind just before we get into the categorical moral imperative about the first part. The other really interesting thing here is, now that we're on the cusp of learning like what this rule is, right? What is this universal moral rule we should follow? Kant makes a very important argument in the beginning of section 2 that we actually cannot always know whether or not our will has conformed with our duty. Because we are finite and pulled in all directions by tendencies and inclinations, because we're so immersed in the world of the particular, discovering truly whether or not we've done our moral duty is a real problem. And Kant casts some doubt as to whether or not we know for sure. For Kant, though, this doesn't matter in terms of the validity of the, this is irrelevant when it comes to whether or not he's right about the pure rule. It's just sad that we might not know for sure whether we've conformed with duty. But based upon his sort of deductive method, whether or not we know, or whether or not there has actually been in fact like a pure act done out of respect for the moral law, is irrelevant to the fact that moral goodness is rooted in conformity to this law that comes from reason, because of reason's the rule maker. It is the site of the form of rules. And so if we want to find the formal rule of morality, that's where we look.